Matt's kind of, those who know, he's from a lacrosse background. He's been in quite a few England training squads. He's part of the playing squad that we took out as a ringer as an under-23 to Japan. But what's really significant for me is the work that Matt's pulled together really for the talent pathway up to the boys under 20 squad, and part of that has also shaped the injury prevention, injury risk reduction for the girls national academy as well. And Matt's just going to talk about how those ideas can also be brought down into the kind of the club game to make the theories and ideas relevant for everyone across the game. So Matt, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Craigie. So thanks for taking the time out to listen to me tonight, guys. Yeah, I'm talking about injury risk reduction. Craigie nearly said it there, also known as injury prevention, but I'll kind of touch on why we call it injury risk reduction shortly. But yeah, Craigie kind of touched on it. I'm a lacrosse player by background, playing at Cheadle Lacrosse Club up in the north, for those who don't know me. And I qualified as a physiotherapist at the University of Birmingham, where I did my Masters in physiotherapy. During my time there, I started to get stuck into sports medicine and the sports side of physiotherapy during my studies. So I was the student physiotherapist for the women's lacrosse team at Birmingham Uni. I also did an internship with Aston Villa Ladies Football Club. Following my qualifying, I took a job with West Bromwich Albion, working with their academy. At the moment, I'm working full-time for a company called Connect Health. So we're an independent provider of musculoskeletal physiotherapy services to the NHS and to corporate businesses delivering occupational health. Still keeping my hand in with sport with England Lacrosse as the lead physiotherapist to the was the under 19s, was the under 20s, now the under 21s, leading up to the 2022 under 21 World Championship. So still doing that to keep me busy outside of my full-time work. So what to expect tonight? I'm just going to scratch the surface on the topic of injury risk reduction strategies, and it's a topic that's heavily researched and new information is always emerging. And what I do hope to do is try and avoid being too scientific, particularly around the research on, and physiology, biomechanics, joint arthrokinematics. I want to try and stay away from that. It's not the scope of this webinar. Instead, I want to try and outline some of the benefits and just give you some guides that you can take away and implement into your coaching when you've listened to this and taken any resources away. So I'm talking about injury risk and how we can try and reduce that. But obviously we need to understand what injury risk is and what an injury is really. And obviously the effect of an injury can be devastating to an athlete, and it's due to the unpleasant nature of experiencing the pain, disability, and then the associated absence from being able to play a sport that they love. There's also the potential need for extensive rehabilitation or surgery, and even with that, there's not always a guarantee of being able to return to play to that same athletic ability, or even returning to play at all. So ideally, we want to try and prevent the injury from happening in the first place, so that people can still remain participating and performing in teams, and then obviously teams have full ability to select all their players because they've not got someone out sitting from injury. But as I kind of touched on before, we actually can't completely prevent an injury, and that's because there's so many risk factors which can increase someone's risk of injury. And the only way we can actually prevent an injury from happening is not playing in the sport in the first place. So what's the point? Some of the factors are internal or intrinsic risk factors, so quite specific to an individual. And some of these might predispose them to certain injuries. So as you can see there in that box, there's a lot of things there, like the age, body composition, physical fitness, skill level, lots of things there which might increase someone's injury. There's also external factors. So like what I've listed there, the sport-specific factors such as the nature of the game, the rules, refereeing, equipment, environment, playing surface, and some of these might increase the likelihood of an injury happening. So if we've got a predisposed athlete due to certain intrinsic risk factors, put them in an environment where there's a lot of external risk factors, they become more susceptible. To add to this, there's normally an inciting event which can trigger an injury. So again, that can be the playing situation, whether someone's defending, reacting to the draw of the ball in the women's game, or a free shot, and these can result in a specific mechanism for an injury, resulting in an injury. So it's a complex interaction of risk factors that result in an injury. And one risk factor in isolation is not usually causative of an injury. So you wouldn't just take one thing from the intrinsic risk factors and say that is solely responsible for your injury. It's usually a combination of these things. And a simple analogy for this, it looks quite complicated here, but is you take a wooden house, okay, it's made of wood, and that's the intrinsic factor, okay, and it's a risk of catching fire because wood is flammable. If you place that house in the woods or near a petrol station or cover it in petrol, you make it more susceptible to a fire, okay? But it's not actually going to catch fire until it's exposed to a naked flame. So that's the inciting event, okay? Combine all that together, you've got a bit of catastrophe. So taking all this model into account, and it's quite an old model, as you can see there, from 2005, and other models have been proposed since, but for the purpose of this, I think it's quite nice and visual, and we can take things from this. So we can look at some of those risk factors, especially some of the intrinsic ones that are associated with certain injuries, and see if any of them are modifiable, like what can we change about those certain things, and what intervention can we put in place. And that might overall reduce the risk of an injury. So even though we can't fully prevent an injury from happening, okay, we can try and reduce the overall risk of it happening by addressing certain risk factors. So when we look at injury surveillance data, so this is from the US over a 10-year period, looking at high schools and colleges of both the men's game and the women's game, okay. We can actually see that from the data there that most injuries come from a contact mechanism. So that's the red part of the graphs there, okay? So contact injuries are obviously classified if an injury is as a result of contact from another player, a stick, a ball or the ground, okay? And within a contact sport, this is an acceptable risk, okay? And it's just due to the nature of the game. And the likelihood of these happening is high. So efforts to reduce this are limited due to the risk factors being less modifiable. However, what we can see in the data is that the second most common mechanism of injury was non-contact mechanisms. So this is where a sudden injury has occurred without contact from another player or object. And these normally occur during running and decelerating at high speed, or landing from a jump or changing direction, often unanticipated or unplanned, and then they often result in muscular strains or joint sprains. So when we look at some of the risk factors for these kind of injuries, these non-contact injuries, we actually see that a lot of these are modifiable intrinsic risk factors. So parts of the athlete, internal factors, such as muscle weakness, poor joint control, or even like poor landing and running technique. So we can start to consider what kind of interventions we can implement to modify these risk factors to try and reduce the overall risk of non-contact injuries. But what's important is to consider what part of the body do we need to consider this in, and what do we need to target. So this is where we do need to look at the data and see what kind of non-contact injuries we might see in lacrosse. Could do a bit of interaction here. If you want to just put in the chat what kind of non-contact injuries you might see, what might you see more in men's or what might you see in women's, and if Craigie, if you just read about if anyone puts anything. So what kind of non-contact injuries do you see the most, or do you think is more likely to happen in a men's lacrosse game or women's lacrosse?
Just shout some thoughts out to Matt. There's a few numbers on the call.
Yeah.
Rick, do you want to put your points across? So Rick asked the question, is there a breakdown between injuries in practice and the game?
In the actual paper, yes. Okay, I just kind of, that's the overall, so that's from competition and practice. I just thought I'd summarise it just for the purpose of this.
I would say hamstrings are probably the one thing that appears to, certainly in practice and in games, is something the men suffer from.
Yeah, a lot of muscular strains, isn't there? Particularly hamstring and groin. Yeah. In this paper, in the men's game, it's ankle sprains, and that's quite consistent with what I've seen in the under 21 boys and the academy, and consistent with the data from previous senior squads. And there was actually a study done on the men's World Lacrosse Championships in 2010, and I think that came up quite high with ankle sprains. So if we apply that previous model on the previous slide, so we've got the intrinsic factors, so that wooden house. For these kind of injuries, we usually see it's stiffness in the ankle, or reduced movement, poor balance, or weak ankle stability muscles, and even a history of ankle sprain itself is a risk factor. So that might predispose an athlete to an injury. And then you can add in some external factors such as choice of cleat or boot that they might use, or field surface that they're playing on. And then that inciting event, so that naked flame, for someone to roll over their ankle, as this picture would show. And that's obviously due to the multi-directional nature of play, from dodging, north, south, east, west, causing sharp and sometimes unplanned changes of direction for someone to just go over their ankle and not have the control in their ankle. So for this injury, some of the modifiable risk factors would be, ankle range of motion, balance, and ankle strength and landing patterns. And in the women's, does anyone know the women's most common? Quite a traumatic one.
Chloe's put in the chat, non-contact injuries, pivoting, impact, ankles and knees.
Yep.
So I think gold star here.
That's it. Yeah. Perfect. So women's knees, it's the dreaded ACL tear, like you said, pivoting, change of direction. Obviously, ankles quite high in women's as well. But it's that dreaded ACL tear or rupture. Sadly, I saw two of these at my time at Birmingham Uni. The two of the lacrosse girls there happened to, and same at Aston Villa ladies as well. And they can be devastating, leading up to between 9 and 12 months plus of absence. And even some research groups are saying that it should be 2 years of absence and rehabilitation. And it commonly occurs of this mechanism here that I've highlighted, and it's like a twisting collapse of the knee due to that unanticipated landing or change of direction. And it just causes that knee to fall inward, and that movement can put an excessive force on the ACL ligament. And unfortunately, females are at higher risk of up to 8 times more compared to the male counterpart. And that's due to many reasons. Looking at those intrinsic risk factors, sadly, some of them are unmodifiable in females, and that's due to sort of like hip and knee anatomy and shape, but also the effects of the menstrual cycle. So where fluctuations of hormones actually has an effect on the laxity of ligaments during certain phases of the cycle. So those kind of things are less modifiable, but there are research, there is research into hormone manipulation. But when we look at some of the more modifiable risk factors in female athletes, we start to see hip muscle weakness is a risk factor for ACL injuries. Quadricep dominant, so this is where the quadricep fires before the hamstring. Poor trunk control, so the top part of the body where the mass is, there's poor control there that can affect what happens lower down in the leg. And landing patterns when they've landed from a jump or from a bound, their patterns tend to favour their knee dropping inwards, which can put more strain on the ACL. So that's just kind of a taste to kind of say, that there's a lot of intrinsic factors that we can actually change, a lot of it being around the muscular system and the nervous system as well. and technique and biomechanics. But it is also important to remember that complete prevention isn't achievable due to a lot of the non-modifiable intrinsic and extrinsic risk factors and the likelihood of inciting events which can cause a mechanism which may result in an injury. So taking what we've just discussed there, we're taking the intrinsic modifiable risk factors, okay, which increase the risk of a non-contact injury. These can be a focus of efforts to try and reduce injury. So I've put there an injury prevention program, which is often what it's referred to in the research. And there is a lot of research and funding into into this. Sorry, my battery's running low. And what is referred to a lot within these injury prevention programs is the use of a form of training called neuromuscular training, or I might refer to it as NMT, so neuromuscular training. And what that focuses on is performing exercises that train the nervous system and the muscles to react and communicate with each other. So when a joint is exposed to forces from, say, landing or change of direction, it can put a joint into a position which might put excess stress on some of the more passive structures, such as the ligaments or the cartilage. So I talked about ankle sprain ligaments, ACL, certain ligaments. And the purpose of neuromuscular training is to try and enhance the ability of the nervous system and the receptors in that joint to recognize that it's in a position that is putting stress on those structures, and then to send signals to the muscles to contract to put it into a more stable position. Okay, so that's essentially what it is. It's trying to train the nervous system to communicate with the muscles to get it into a more stable position to protect the joint. So if we take that female player, for example, she changes direction. The force of that might cause a knee to drop inwards and twist, okay, which might put strain on the ACL. And due to some of those intrinsic risk factors, she might have poor control of her knee, so hip weakness, quadricep dominance, poor trunk control. So all of these things just adding more force into that movement. Now, the aim of neuromuscular training would to train the athlete to be able to plant a leg into a more stable position. So as you can see here, the position on the right is a more dangerous position for the ACL. Okay, position here on the left, kind of a more stable, protected position due to her muscles receiving the information from the nerves around the knee. Okay, so that's probably about as scientific as I'm going to try and stay with this. So sounds really complicated. Neuromuscular training, trains the nerves and the muscles, but don't be put off by the name. It's simply just implementing some strengthening training to develop the body's ability to create and control the forces from these maneuvers. Balance exercises, so both static and standing on one leg, being able to tolerate load on one leg, and more dynamic sort of balances such as hopping. Jumping and landing, where the player will learn to control the forces when landing and produce the forces to jump. And then kind of your more running based, cutting, change of direction and deceleration based drills. So there's a lot of research comparing injury rates between groups of athletes that have completed neuromuscular training compared to groups that didn't and just did, just played their sport. And depending where you read, the general consensus is that those that have completed regular neuromuscular training have a reduced incidence of non-contact injuries, such as ACL injuries and ankle sprains, by up to 50%. Again, depending where you read, there's different rates of how it has reduced it. Interestingly, it's also shown to improve performance indicators such as speed, agility, power, and balance. So not just reducing the risk of injury, can also improve someone's performance as well. And a lot more work is being done on the sort of more optimal way to prescribe this kind of training. But studies are starting to indicate around 30 minutes of neuromuscular training per week was effective at reducing risk of injury. So I know what you might be thinking. it all sounds great, all sounds good, but I only get a short amount of time with my players. I can't afford to spend 30 minutes having them stand on one leg, jumping about, and no lacrosse would get done. I get that. But what you might be able to do, you might be able to utilize the time during an activity that you already have scheduled into your training, where you can start to implement some neuromuscular training ideas. And this can be done in the warm-up. So, you know, your warm-up's typically an activity that can be performed between 10 to 20 minutes. If you have one scheduled during one training session a week and one of your matches, you can perform a warm-up containing NMT exercises for 15 minutes, and you'll have achieved your 30 minutes of neuromuscular training for that week, and that will elicit a positive effect and hopefully reduce the risk of these non-contact injuries through neuromuscular training. Okay. So this is a warm-up system that can be implemented to not only aim to improve the short-term performance, but also long-term athletic development and injury risk reduction through neuromuscular training. So it's called the ramp warm-up, and it's a system designed by Dr. Ian Jeffries, who's I think he's a fellow in Cardiff of strength and conditioning and sports science. And you can put it together with the aim of systematically structuring the warm-up to prepare athletes for physical activity, but also try and encourage long-term athletic development by allowing the opportunity to expose athletes through athletic movement competencies. So start to train athletes to move in a more athletic way. And it's basically broken down into 3 phases, and a lot of it was based on performance purely. A little bit of injury risk reduction in there, but mainly about how they can improve performance in subsequent activity, but also in the long term. So the raise phase, as it says there, it's the aim is to increase the muscle and the body temperature, which is key to increase the rate of the heart, the rate of your breathing, the nervous activity within the body, and the metabolic activity to allow for efficient energy production for the subsequent activity. And then, the next 2 phases, activate and mobilize, tend to get joined together. And the aim of that is to increase the elasticity and reduce the viscosity of the muscle tissue to allow for greater range of movement within the joints, and also start to increase that neuromuscular activity. So start to wake up the muscles and the nerves in the body to produce force and power. Now, most warm-ups tend to include some kind of raise phase, whether that's just taking a lap around the field, followed by a dynamic stretch, which may start to activate and mobilize the body. What I personally think a lot of warm-ups do lack is a thorough potentiation phase. Now, the potentiation phase, this is basically aiming to increase the intensity and utilize a phenomenon called post-activation potentiation or post-activation performance enhancement. Now, in simple terms, that's when performance in the body is improved following performing something at a higher intensity. So take, for example, you're in the gym and you bench press 80 kilograms for a few repetitions, and then you go down and bench 60 kilograms, and it feels easier and it feels like you can do more. That's just because you've exposed your body to a higher intensity and it's recruited more muscles and more nerve endings to activate this. Okay, so we're trying to get that effect within the potentiation phase, which is the last phase. Okay, and some warm-ups might contain this, but it's normally limited, just maybe a few build-up sprints, and then kind of go straight into a game or pre-game scrimmage, and then you put your body through max intensity change direction and sprints that a build-up sprint doesn't quite replicate. So you can see there's a need to kind of build up to that a little bit further. And you can see that this warm-up is very focused on preparing the body for the activity to come, so whether it's pre-game or training. Okay, and there will be some elements of reducing risk of injury here, such as muscle strains, like Rick said, with hamstring injuries, by increasing that muscle temperature. What might not be as activated is that more neuromuscular function of the muscle. But here we can start to implement some of those neuromuscular training principles. Okay, so we can start to facilitate that long-term injury risk reduction strategy by implementing some of the strength, balance, jumping and landing activities, and those cutting and running drills in some of these. Okay, and they're quite easy to slot in, and you might find that you're actually already doing some of this but not realizing it. So I'm going to give a few examples of this so that you can start to consider is it something you do, is it something that you can take away and put in your practice as well. So I'm hoping my videos work, but yep, good stuff. Is that playing for you guys yet?
Yes.
Lovely. So probably the most important part of the warm-up, raise the body's core and muscle temperature. Elevated muscle temperature allows the muscles to contract more forcefully to produce more power and more nerve signals to be sent, and to therefore recruit much more parts of the muscle to therefore generate more force, which is obviously beneficial for performance. As you can see on that video there, that's just simply just jogging forwards, and the way I set out my warm-ups are in this configuration that you see here on the bottom right, kind of a start cone, play, and then followed by 4 more cones. So you've got 5 cones there, a middle cone and an end cone, and then the players will stand to the right, about 4 or 5 in each line, and then they'll go from the right of the line and go all the way round like that, and then back to where they were. So nice and simple one to start off with would just be to get them jogging round the cones, maybe go through twice through. And it's beneficial to start to explore the different planes of motion, so not just forwards, but you can kind of start to go shuffling side to side and move backwards as well. As I said before, lacrosse is multi-directional. We're not kind of just going forwards and backwards, and then we can start to look kind of more sideways as well if we're moving in a more lateral position. Okay, so again, nothing groundbreaking there, more just to aim to build up that body temperature. Okay, so then the next phase, the activation of the mobilization phase. In the short term, aim is to move the body through its range of motion, trying to get those joints opened up, get the muscles nice and flexible. Okay, and it's key for fundamental movement patterns like squats, lunges, and hinges. So that's where this more long-term athletic development comes in. We're getting athletes exposed to these more athletic positions. Okay, and it involves controlled movement in each pattern. So that's where this activation part comes in. And this is where I might start to implement some of the more neuromuscular parts, such as the strengthening and the balance, to start to activate the nerves and the muscles in the system, to allow for dynamic joint stability. So some examples that can be seen here would be something like a sumo squat. So starting to see within this example, starting to mobilize the hips, the ankle, and even a little bit of the upper back. Okay, but we're also activating the big power muscles of the legs, such as the glutes, the hamstrings, and the quads. But we're also ticking that box within the neuromuscular training for body weight strengthening. So these muscles are going to encourage greater control at the knee and be able to produce, and the legs are going to be able to produce and tolerate force. The next one would be an Arabesque or a single leg Romanian deadlift. Here we're mobilizing and strengthening the hamstring. Quite a good one for stretching the hamstring as well if it's feeling quite tight. But we're also challenging the leg that's taking the weight. So it's starting to go through that dynamic balance. So we're challenging the stability and the neuromuscular capacity of the lower part of the leg as well to be able to maintain balance, especially as we're moving our body weight out, as I nearly fell there, outside of our base of support. So again, ticking that box on the more balanced side of neuromuscular training. And another one I put in there is a combined drill with inchworms. So this is getting the player to start off in a high plank position. So they're starting to use their core to brace themselves, okay, and stabilizing themselves through their shoulders. So not just an exercise to start to mobilize the hamstrings and the calf through a little bit of stretching. We're also getting that strengthening and that core stability in with this one as well. And the second one, world's greatest stretch, pretty much as it says on the tin, really good mobility exercise for opening up the hips and the upper back as well. Lacrosse is a rotational sport, whether we're passing, we're catching, having good rotation in the upper back is key as well. Other examples would be sort of Cossack squats. So a lot of people look at this and thinking, oh yeah, that's a good groin stretch there, but that would just be focusing on that leg that's straight. If we look at what the other leg's doing, nice bent, stable position. Okay, we're activating the quads, we're activating the glutes to stay nice and stable there. And a lot of what we do is in lacrosse is actually single leg, whether that's running, landing, or changing direction. We're really dependent on the strength of our leg to be able to do something on its own without the other one, whether that's absorbing force or producing force. It's really fundamental that we have that baseline strength. So other things such as lunges are a really good thing to implement there as a strengthening exercise around the knee. So really trying to get the athletes to think about these movements as well, instead of just going through the motions. Concentrate on technique. We don't just want them to go through a lunge with really unstable knee falling inwards, poor trunk stability going to each side. Really getting them to really starting to cue them to say nice stable knees, knees in line with toes, and engaging the cores as well. Now the potentiation phase. So the main aims are to increase the intensity to closely match the upcoming activity, to make the warm-up drills or exercise more specific to the demands of the sport. It's focused on achieving a seamless transition from the warm-up into competition so that players can begin the game or training fully prepared. So the main idea of this phase is to excite the nervous system and the muscles so that when the high athletic demands of the sport occur, it's not a shock to the system and everything can be stable and prepared to move. So here, this is where we might add those jumping and landing exercises as part of the neuromuscular training to reduce the risk of injury, change of direction and deceleration. From an injury prevention, injury reduction point of view, these help the bodies to produce and absorb and control many of the forces from the movement. So some examples here would be pogo. So over the first 5 cones of that configuration that I said before, just nice and simply, I'll just get them doing some pogos, and this is where they'll produce some force nice and quick, mainly through the calves and the ankles, very little involved in the knee there, just to start to activate the lower part of the legs. And then I might also do this sidewards as well to kind of start to encourage that push off sidewards during the dodge, for example, and then just get them to sprint through. And then into more bounding. So this is where we'd start to activate some of the upper leg. So really focusing on that knee control, absorbing that landing, not letting those knees drop in, activating the hip muscles to try and keep that knee in a nice stable position. And with the younger players, the ones that haven't been exposed to these kind of high intensity moves, I'd start with these kind of exercises with both legs together, just to start to develop that strength and stability and force absorption through these high demanding maneuvers in more of a safer position, get them learning it. And then, as I said before, we really want to develop that single leg control and force production and absorption. So that's where we might progress on to more high skips. So jumping off one leg, landing on one leg, and then alternating, and then skater jumps where we might go to each side. Again, really focusing on a nice stable knee and stable ankle as well. And then lastly, just an example of a running drill. So this can be going change of direction. This one here, I've just gone for a deceleration. So getting the athlete to accelerate up to the middle cone, decelerate with control, take a couple of steps back and sprint through. So that's the warm up. That's kind of what I propose before a game, and how you can prepare an athlete not only just for the activity that's coming ahead, but also more in the long term as well, and try and reduce that risk of injury. Also want to talk about reactivators. They've been a topic of discussion within the research, and this is where what I mean by reactivator is basically a warm up during half time or after you've already played a game, and say during a tournament, then you might do another little warm up to get going again. And it's basically stemmed off after 10 minutes of stopping an activity. So say if a half time lasts longer than 10 minutes, we start to see a decrease in the body temperature, which will in turn reduce muscle temperature and the activity of the nerves and the muscles. And some research has actually shown that it has a positive effect in improving subsequent performance in speed and power. So those that did a reactivator at half time actually had better improvement in things like speed and power after they did a reactivator compared to those that didn't. Although I'm talking about injury risk reduction, to my knowledge, there's actually no published research on the effect on injury rates between those who did a reactivator at half time and those that didn't. Probably make a good PhD question. But my theory is if the body temperature decreases, we start to cool down, and in terms our muscles won't be at that active state. They might start to stiffen up and feel tight. We've all been in those who play, we've all been in tournaments where we've played a game, we've had to wait a little while, then get going again, and then you see some people dropping out with strains and other injuries. And there's also the effects on the nervous system. When our bodies cool down, it slows down the conduction of our nerves. So that is going to reduce that communication between our muscles and the joint position sense. So when I was talking about joints being in certain positions, which stresses some of the structures, if that communication is slowed down, your muscles have got no chance in time to contract to try and stabilize itself. However, the caveat to that is if we do a re-warm up that might potentially fatigue an athlete, that might actually increase their risk of injury. So it's about getting the balance. An activator that I did with the under 21s, I just took a few of the exercises from the raise part of the ramp warm up and some of the exercises from the potentiate phase of the warm up. So starting off with things like jogging and shuffles, just to raise that body temperature again, and then started to go into those more dynamic and more higher intense exercises such as jumps and skips and decelerations, accelerations, just to start to get that nervous system firing again, starting to get it recognizing the intensity that it needs to get back to. And
playing the sport is a lot of fun, and getting better at the sport. Playing the sport is a lot of fun, and getting better at the sport is a lot of fun. It involves a lot of hard work and a lot of dedication, a lot of commitment.
Matt, can I just ask a question? It's too long to write. It's interesting you're doing that even though it's very warm. Does the body still warm down even in hot weather if you have more than 10 minutes break?
That's the other thing to take into account as well, is if you're on what do they call it in international? Is it a stage 3 weather condition or something? Like if it's really hot, that might be where you have to look at your players. Do they look like they're at risk of heat exhaustion? That might be where no, actually you're getting some ice on, you're getting a hot towel on instead. So again, yeah, it's about reading that and taking that into account as well. So yeah, I'd probably say on those, if the athletes are looking like they're close to heat exhaustion, that might be where you rethink what you prioritize. Does that answer your question, Rick?
No, sorry. The point is, even if it's warm
Mm-hmm.
and you have, say, a 20-minute break, does the body, in terms of the muscles and what have you, warm down anyway, irrespective of the temperature, the ambient temperature?
It'll warm down more than it would if they were still active. Yeah, there'll still be a cooling down period.
So what we're saying, even in hot weather, if you have a 20-minute break, you should do a reactivator.
I'd say yeah, some form of reactivator. Yeah, if the time away from playing is longer than sort of 10-15 minutes, then yeah, some form of reactivator. Again, you might not go as intense, just because it won't take as long to re-warm them up, if that makes sense. So the answer is yes, you probably would, because there would still be an element of the body cooling down, and therefore the muscles maybe stiffening up, and the nerves not being as active. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, what I meant to say before that video was just an example of a reactivator during the game in the Euros against Latvia. So when once the players had stopped playing, they'd go to the coaches, take on water, take on any tactical information, any more technical skill information, and then just a little quick activator like that, get them going again. And then they get, it's a good opportunity for them to absorb the information they've just received, and then we're physiologically preparing their body again. So that was just a little bit on activators. So what about cooling down and recovery then? So your end of your sessions. So it's widely thought that a cool down can improve subsequent performance and reduce the risk of injury. So doing things like active and passive cool downs have been thought to have a positive psychological and physiological effect to try and improve performance and reduce the risk of injury. Okay, but the empirical evidence and the research doesn't seem to have a consensus on this, and it doesn't support that theory, that doing these things actually have a positive effect on when we look at the physiological measurements and some of the psychological measurements. But what we do know that there are some fundamental, that some of the proposed mechanisms, the proposed effects that it may have. But what we do know that there are some fundamentals for recovery and injury risk reduction, and they mainly involve around sort of refueling, rehydration, and sleep. So that's something that it should be encouraged and educated with athletes. Okay. Interestingly, with sleep in particular, not only does it have an impact on the physiological growth and repair, it has an impact on likelihood of injury. So for any athletes who sleep less than 8 hours, it actually increases their injury, their likelihood of injury by nearly 2 times more than if they did have 8 hours of sleep or more. So whenever I'm asked for advice and opinion on parts of recovery, such as cool downs, should we use ice or heat baths, compression garments, foam rolling, or massage tools, the question that should be asked first is, are you doing the fundamentals right? So for optimal recovery, the fundamentals need to be done. And I'd say it's definitely those bottom two: the sleeping, the resting, the nutrition, and the hydration. And then I'd probably throw in some active recovery there. Anything above that, you can be considered as your 1% or even your placebos, and really will only have any positive effect if the fundamentals are done. So although the evidence is limited around active recovery, the theory is that it's the contraction and relaxation of the muscles during some forms of low intensity exercise, such as mobility or stretching, or even like low resistance cardiovascular activity, that it's going to have this kind of pumping effect and improving blood flow. And it's that blood flow that can aid with bringing new nutrients to the muscles to help it recover and repair, and also removing the waste products, those byproducts from the biochemical reactions during exercise. There's also a theory.
Rick's got a question. Sorry,
Yeah.
Matt.
No, go on.
I haven't got a question. Sorry, no.
Sorry, Matt. I rudely interrupted you.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, as I said, the theory about the physical side of it, but there's also a theory that active recovery can help a player relax and sort of bring down that psychological arousal level that might have occurred during a game or a training situation, and that in turn could be useful for promoting sleep and relaxation. So as we know, that's one of our fundamentals. If active recovery is going to help with that, then it's very important, isn't it? We're like, let's do that for that athlete. So a few ways we can do this is just through some simple mobility exercises. So a few examples there. So just starting to get the muscles and the joints to move, just to promote that kind of pumping, that muscle pump, that blood flow. But the way it's also thought to try and get an athlete to relax, it starts to activate a different part of the nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, which just starts to calm everything back down and bring everything back down to normal levels. Other ways we can do it is just through some static stretching as well. So putting the muscle on length, okay, squeezing the blood out. When it comes back to normal, squeezing it back in again can also start to make the athlete feel a lot less tight and a lot more mobile following it as well. And also some foam rolling as well. Again, one of the only things that we can really conclude that foam rolling is good for is improving short-term mobility and reducing the perception of exercise-induced soreness. So when you've exercised, your muscles feel quite tight and sore. Foam rolling has been shown that for some people, it does have a positive effect of that. So there are some strategies that that can be put in, just some simple dynamic stretches that have already been done, some static stretching and some foam rolling for them to do in their own time. So an alternative use of the 10 minutes you might use for a cool down, if you feel like active recovery can be done elsewhere, or the player can do that in their own time, you could utilize it to implement some of those neuromuscular training exercises that I mentioned before. And a recent study actually demonstrated that doing these at the end of the session had a really positive impact for reducing the risk of injury. And I think that's probably to do with the players completing them whilst they're fatigued after doing the game or doing the training. So then it's starting to challenge the muscles and the nerves to be able to work while the body's fatigued. And fatigue itself is known to be a risk factor for injuries. So if we can start to try and reduce, try and increase someone's capacity to being fatigued and still be able to work the neuromuscular system effectively, then we might be having more of a positive effect here. So put some examples here for a couple of strengthening exercises, and they can be done more statically. These ones doesn't necessarily need to be set up in the ramp warm-up, for example, and you can really concentrate on some core stability work, such as planks and side planks. Side planks are not only just working the core, they're also working the hip muscles as well, which are really important for knee stability. And those bottom two and the bottom left, the Nordic hamstring curl, specifically for hamstring strains. So like you said, Rick, quite common. And the Nordic hamstring curl exercise, where someone holds your feet and then you slowly lower yourself forward, has been researched so much to have a positive effect on reducing the risk of hamstring strains. And then line adduction there, kind of paint like one of your French girls pose, just to strengthen the groin a little bit more there. And then, as you can see, there's some single leg balance, good old squat, and then some landing with vertical jumps as well. So for me, it depends on the situation, which approach you may use. So like I say, I've thrown two approaches at you there. I've said, you can either do active recovery or do some neuromuscular training exercises. So again, it just depends on the situation. So if I was the physio out on tour with the under-21 squad in a tournament, playing multiple games within a week, I'd opt for a more active recovery approach, just to try and promote those athletes to relax and feel a lot better for their game the next day. I'd probably get no beneficial effect from doing these out on tour or during like a competitive schedule. If anything, I'll just be fatiguing them more. But if I was, say, delivering an under 15s boys academy session on a monthly basis, where delivering sort of strength and promoting neuromuscular development at that age would be beneficial, I might utilize that time to start to encourage that, but then also educate and promote self-management with regards to the active recovery. So that's things like, here's your resources. You guys are starting to develop into potential international athletes. These are things that you can do to start to look after your body. Okay, but whilst you're in training, I want to go through this with you. So I choose whatever you think will benefit your group more at that point during the training or playing schedule, but just to kind of show that you can do some of these at the end of the session, and the more active recovery can be utilised within their own time. So in terms of what I've talked about there, those injury risk reduction strategies through neuromuscular training is just one piece of the puzzle when we think about injuries. There's lots of other things, but I kind of just summarised the research, and by no means I'm not a world leading expert in the matter, but just from experience with my work with England Lacrosse and with and any kind of research that I've done, implementing these strategies can help reduce your risk of injury. With that, you're increasing the availability of players for your games. You're not going to have an injured sideline. As I mentioned before, they can increase athletic performance. So with that, you've got full player availability. You're going to increase your chance of winning games. Thank you very much.
That's great, Matt. Has anyone got any questions? I'm very conscious of time, but Matt's been very thorough there, and it was great that Rick contributed with some questions.
Hey, Matt, it's Mark Coops. How are you?
I'm all right, thanks. How are you?
Not bad. First of all, thanks for the presentation. I found it very impressive indeed, and the way you put it together is brilliant, because it'll enable us to be able to use it with beyond this group. So just an enormous amount of thanks from me around putting so much effort into it. One of the questions that I've got, which I think that, again, it's for the group as well as my own benefit, is we've very rarely not got players who are already carrying some sort of injury themselves. Mm-hmm. And I'm a big fan of ramps. How do you manage those players that have got existing, let's call them niggles? They're nearly always some sort of long-term injury, aren't they, that we're managing to get them in on a field of play. How do you do that while ensuring that you do your ramp warm-ups properly and get the benefits from doing that? How do you think we ought to manage that situations?
Yeah, so Mark, just to clarify your question, so are you saying, so for those players that might have more specific injuries that are long term that they manage, how do we manage that and implement that within the ramp? Is
correct?
That, yeah, no problem. Yeah, I mean, really, that comes down to it comes down to communication and knowing what that athlete may need to do to manage that injury. So if they've been seen by a physiotherapist, if they've been seen by whoever that may be, they should be developing their own preparation to try and manage and reduce the risk of that injury. So that's something that they can maybe do in their own time, or should they need to modify anything within a ramp warm up just to meet their needs. So that would be how I would go about it. I think what I'd also be looking at, like I said there, that was basically one aspect of injury risk reduction. Another one, which I imagine you get quite a lot with the girls, especially the ones that play multiple sports, would be load management. So getting them to understand that, and yourselves to understand how much they're putting their bodies through as well, and for sometimes it's those players, they just need to completely tone down their training a little bit and just take a bit more recovery and a bit more of the regeneration side. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. I think
yeah, I mean, I think that it does mostly. I think the thing is that where there is a kind of a not degree of frustration, a degree of a bit of extra thought and knowledge, is I get an awful lot of athletes coming up saying, well, I can't do that bit of ramps because of whatever I'm carrying. And then when you sit down and you talk to them, actually, it's not. They've just decided that they shouldn't be doing that because I've got a sore knee and my physio's treating it. And so therefore don't do that bit because that's obviously doing something to my knee. Whereas in fact, they should be doing it because they're not getting the benefits of the ramp system, which is the long-term cure for a lot of the niggles that they've got. And it's just that balance, isn't it? Understanding about how you communicate with the athlete and ensure that you're doing the right kind of warm-up that not only prevents injury or monitors and assists an ongoing injury, but helps them in the long term. Yeah.
My question to the athlete would be, what, if you're not fit enough to do this warm up, what makes you fit enough to play a game of lacrosse? One of the most intense games that there probably is. If you can't hold your body weight on the floor in that high plank position, what's going to happen when someone barges into your shoulder at a much higher force? So that would be my counter argument to it. If obviously, are they fit enough to play if they can't do a warm up?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that's spot on. And again, we all have to manage those players on and off the pitch. And I think that you're absolutely right with the loading that we're experiencing from some of the players. That also needs to be brought into consideration, and that's to do with whether you actually play them. I completely get that.
I'll just manage the chat here for you. I've got a question from Lucy. Lucy Halliday. How long would you recommend a warm-up, including every phase of the ramp, to be? Would this differ between pre-training and pre-game?
Like I say, it depends how much time you've got. So from experience out in the Euros with the under 21s, I think, was it about 15 minutes I was able to do it for, Craigie?
It's quite funny when we started it looked like it was about 45 minutes, and then it kind of reduced with how frequent the lads started to run it. And same with, sorry to jump in, Matt, same with the academy, particularly the girls who've had it for the best part of the year, 18 months now, something like that. It's 15-20 minutes to run through the more detailed one. Just to provide a bit of context, we've talked about the need for kind of the club environment, the school environment, where you don't have as long a time to prepare. And you've pulled together your key points in this, and it's kind of a 10-15 minute, isn't it, that you think the exercises you put forward can be run and still have an impact, which I think is really important as a message to put out. Sorry, I interrupted you there, Matt.
No, hit the nail on the head. Yeah, it's kind of it depends what you can give. Like I say, you can hit every one of those phases of ramp with a couple of exercises. You just got to be smart with which ones you use to utilize what you want to get out of it. Would this differ pre-training, pre-game? Again, depending on time constraints and how long's your training session. If you only got them for an hour, if you can give 10 to 15 minutes of that as a warm up, not only just to prepare them for the training session, but also reducing the risk of injury for the rest of the season, then I think it's worth investing the time into. But I'd say if you go in less than 10-15 minutes, it's going to be less effective. So I'd aim for that kind of 15 minutes if you can.
Have we got any more questions for Matt in particular?
I've just got a quick one, if that's okay, Martin.
Hi, Chloe.
Hi. Just a quick question for kind of the younger athletes that are in the academy setup and within schools. I think it's vaguely been mentioned within the call, but we have many temporary injuries due to obviously growth in the athletes, a lot of knee pain or back pain due to compensation because they're moving differently and adjusting to kind of their new bodies as they grow. What would you mostly recommend for them with regards to injury prevention? Obviously, it's all very important, but as they are growing up and settling into their new bodies and learning how to become an athlete, what would you say are the most important factors to highlight for them with regards to injury prevention? Yeah,
that's a great question. I'd definitely say movement, competency and pattern. So how they're moving their bodies. Like you say, if there is compensation occurring as they're growing, is that compensation going to correct itself, or is that going to start to stress other structures and put those structures at risk? So definitely movement patterns and movement competency. So that would be in your mobilization and activation phase. Also strengthening as well. In years gone by, it was always frowned upon to get children and young adolescents to strengthen big whilst they're growing. But there's actually no evidence to say like stunts growth. I think that's what they used to say. So getting as they grow and exposing them to some load during strengthening is only going to help them as they get older. So they'll be my main two, I'd say. Definitely movement patterns, movement, strength, and then obviously starting to expose them to some of the landing patterns as well, get them landing well, getting them controlling their bodies. But yeah, I think that would be what I'd focus on the most.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Have we got any more questions? I think that's probably exhausted most. Oh, Stephen's got a question.
Yeah,
hi, Stephen.
Yeah, hi, Matt. Are you sort of working collaboratively with Richard Layler on this sort of program across all squads? Are you all sort of as a team looking at this?
How can I answer that? The two are kind of starting to come together and be a lot more, have a joined up approach. What's great is both Matt and Richard have a very similar belief and ethos. Trying to tie everyone together to then move the programs on. That's what we've got to do. Rich is fully aware of the work that Matt's done with the academies and so on, and is well informed of that and uses it as an understanding within the talent pathway.
Yeah.
So to answer your point, both Matt and Rich are informed of each other's work. We've just got to get it to map it together a little bit tighter.
Yeah, no, it looks good. No, thanks, guys. Cheers.
Right. Well, I'll do the task of kind of wrapping this up. Unless James moved. If you haven't got any more questions, I think it's just a big thank you to Matt. I know that a lot of this work is probably 2.5 years in the making. And I think it's only going to be beneficial for the game as we kind of go forward, because it's not just, it's moving past the idea of dynamic stretches and so on. We're so far beyond that. So it's great, Matt, that you provided your thoughts, your research yourself, and put it forward for everyone to use. So I really thank you for that.
No problem. Pleasure.
All right. Well, if we have no more questions, I'll kind of wrap this up. Thanks, everyone.